Excellent.
I was looking to it.
All right, so last week we talked about the divide, right? We talked about a little bit of the history, the build up to the separation between Orthodoxy and what was then the Catholic Church. Today we're going to talk about some of the things that happened after the schism that happened in 1054, and some of the things that made that divide even bigger. And then we'll talk a little bit about what happened to the Catholic Church after the schism, something called the Reformation, something that I'm pretty sure almost all of you are more familiar with than I. So I won't go too much detail about that, other than the way that what it has to do with us, the Orthodox Church. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's called the Turcocratia. This is the period after the fall of Constantinople, when the Greek-speaking Christians, really all the Orthodox Christians in the Mediterranean world, were living underneath the Turks. So before we get into that, we covered so much stuff last week. Are there any questions about any of the things we talked about last week? So either it was so boring you forgot it completely, or did such a good job that there's no questions remaining. I'll pretend it's the second.
Yeah.
All right. So the schism took place in 1054. And I think sometimes we think of this as like, we maybe get a little bit too mechanical with it. Like the entire, heresy, orthodoxy. I don't think it's that black and white. As we saw last week, even before the schism, there was a lot of theological, a lot of cultural, there's a lot of divergence that was already taking place in places in the West. At the same time, though, even after the schism, there were people that, probably for generations, didn't know that there was a schism, right? So especially in places that were removed from the Roman center, like the British Isles, you have people that continued to see, to believe, to practice an undivided faith. And so some people have argued, some theologians and historians have argued that the British Isles actually, one could, I think pretty confidently say, remained Orthodox until after the events of 1099. And so the schism kind of took place later there. Anyone know what happened in 1099? The Normans.
Oh, yeah.
The Normans invaded. The part of that support from the almost not yet, but was becoming an actual papal state. The support from the Pope was that when the Normans took over, they would begin to enforce this allegiance to the Pope as kind of the supreme head of the church. Before that, you can almost argue that the bishops in the British Isles were more closely aligned with the bishop in Alexandria than the bishop in Rome. Some of you might wonder, why would the bishops in Rome have more of a connection to the bishop in Alexandria than Rome? That's Africa, right? Well, the majority of the bishops, most of the people that founded monasticism in the British Isles, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, came from Egypt, right? This is at the time of the Desert Fathers. We've got St. Anthony coming up this Tuesday. They would go, people like St. Cassian and his conferences. Now, he wasn't British, he was a Gaul, right? He lived in modern day France, but they would go to the source, right? The place is where St. Anthony lived, St. Macarius, St. Arsenius. And so you have a lot of Alexandrian traditions that are there. But needless to say, when the Normans come along, they replace the bishops, mostly with their own French-speaking bishops, but primarily those that are allied with the Pope.
So Father Micah has given you a little bit of the graduate student seminars, right?
Sorry.
No. So I learned in undergrad, they teach you everything about your subject. And then in grad school, they teach you why what you learned in undergrad is all wrong, right? We're teaching you the schism happened in 1054. Well, it's true, but it's not true. I mean, so the graduate student version is that the schism really took place over a period of time. And so for simplicity's sake, if you had a multiple choice test that asked you when the schism was, you'd probably put 1054. But really the reality, like Father Micah says, is much more complicated. And that at 1054, when the exchange of the anathemas happened, the East and the West had already excommunicated each other over 200 times before 1054. But what had happened, and this is the way the Orthodox Church works until this day, is that if there is a dispute that rises to a certain level, then the answer is that they cease communing with each other. They no longer recognize that we're in communion. It doesn't mean that the person is in a heresy. It means that something has developed, usually something administrative, to block communion. So it doesn't mean that we're different faiths. It just means temporarily there's a situation, and that the expectation of the Orthodox Church is always that these are going to get resolved. Now, the Orthodox Church, the pace of things is very different from our American pace of things. So it may take a few hundred years. In the case of the schism, it's been over 1,000 years, almost 1,000 years now. But we still believe deep down that these things are meant to be resolved. And so, in God's good time, maybe it will be resolved. But the same thing happens even to this day. You may have heard something, I don't want to go too much into it, about the situation with the church in Ukraine and the Russian church and our Patriarch of Constantinople. Before that, a few years ago, there was a debate between the Church of Jerusalem and the Church of Antioch over jurisdiction in the Middle East. Basically, they no longer were in communion with each other. The Romanian church was no longer in communion with the Jerusalem church for a while over a dispute. And so these things happen, but they're generally resolved within a few years. But that's how discipline is maintained in the church. It's since we don't have one central figure who has all the authority like in the West, what happens is that we need to self-police, basically. So if one bishop, or even on the level of the priests, if one priest is acting out of accord with what the priest should be teaching, etc., it's the responsibility of the bishop above him to call him out, to temporarily suspend him, etc. Same with the level of bishops. If something is happening, it's the responsibility of the other bishops, since there's no one to go ahead, top of it, to self-police each other and to tell each other, no, you've gone too far. Witness of the church, is this, and then you need to pray for yourself.
So, thank you for drawing me back a little bit. I can, especially in areas that, yeah.
So if the bishop says the wrong thing, he gets addressed from, the other bishops.
Yeah.
Does he come back and make a correction?
Yeah.
What he doesn't say is again,
It could be either. It depends on how serious the infraction is, etc. If it's simply something which we see this happen in Greece, for example, where the whole country is Orthodox, you have 75 bishops, maybe one bishop who's a little more politically conservative or liberal, who says something regarding some national issue that's a little bit political. The other bishops might push back. It's basically tell them, stay out of this, it's not your area. And so from that point, he may just keep silent. He may issue an apology or a correction, but he may just keep silent because it hasn't risen to the level where they're threatening to suspend it, or to cease communication. But it's a manner, if it got more serious, eventually it would get to the point where they would cease communion with each other. Now that's kind of like the final step for when it's really serious.
If some bishops and priests have they been excommunicated? Is that the right term to use? Where they have been excommunicated, but then they were reinstilled as canon of the church, but for one point they were basically excommunicated
That
and
can happen, yeah.
that,
Usually the canons say that if a layman falls into heresy and he's leading heresy, teaching heresy, and if the church excommunicates him, it means he's out. He can no longer take communion in the Orthodox Church. Usually what happens in the case of clergy is that they're stripped of their office and returned in the state of a layperson. So they're still Orthodox. So it's like, that's the first step, is the return to the state of a layperson. And then if they were to persist in teaching as a layperson heresy, then they might be excommunicated altogether. But this is all, it's a method to enforce discipline in the church, but it's interesting because it has to come from within, which is a very different thing than having one person on top, right? So it's a little bit more organic procedure. Makes sense.
On the Norman invasion, had they begun converting at that point when they were invading, or was that after?
Who converting?
The Normans themselves, because I know a lot of them converted.
Yeah, so the Normans, so these are what is now Normandy, right? That
Yeah.
northwestern part of France.
Yeah.
Norsemen, right? They came from the north, they ended up there. They've already almost entirely converted,
Okay.
right? They're the papacy we talked about last week has kind of been taken over by this Germanic aristocracy, right? Has replaced the Roman, right? It's no longer really Roman. So they're Christians, but they're wholly aligned with the Pope and supportive of really all the things that led up to the schism. So when they go to the British Isles, they, get rid of the bishops. You go, it would be like a bishop from Italy going to a bishop in Greece and saying, you can't do that because the Pope of Rome said this. The bishop in Greece would be like, what are you talking about? That's absurd. So they just got rid of all the, yes.
They essentially just took
Yeah.
over. Yeah.
And then this is an important concept because I think in our day and age, with the advent of Protestantism, Christianity has become a lot more individualized, right? Whereas this model, it's really about the community because you're protecting the boundaries of the community. And if you look at heresy like a sickness, like a virus, then it's the responsibility of the church as a whole, and especially its clergy, its leadership, to protect the boundaries of the church so that no virus enters therein. And this is the way that you protect that. And it assumes that we have all things in common. It doesn't mean that there's exact uniformity because like what Micah was saying, before the schism, there were already differences. They were accepted differences. They were unified though in their theology. Once it reaches the point where there's heresy introduced, that's when you have a problem. And I grew up in an Episcopalian church. And one of the things that really bothered me when I first started studying early Christianity and realizing that this was the mechanism how the church always worked was there was, I think in the 70s, maybe some of you might remember this, there was a bishop of New Jersey, Episcopalian bishop of New Jersey named John Spong. Anybody remember him? And he was an academic and not basically, in very fact, he denied the resurrection as a myth. He denied the virgin birth as a myth, but he was the bishop. And no one in the Episcopalian church, none of the other clergy or bishops did anything. They just let him go. He was going on TV and saying these things, he was preaching these things. Now, in the Orthodox Church, the way that you would handle that is all the other bishops would be required. I mean, it would be their obligation to stand up and say, I cease communion with this person as long as he continues without repenting to teach these heresies publicly, because clearly it's a heresy. There's no shade of gray, right? But it didn't happen because there's a sense now that Christianity is individualized and like, oh, well, if he wants to believe that, that's fine. But, that's not how a liturgical church works. It's governed by bishops. The bishops and the priests aren't free to be ignorant. They're required to know the faith and protect it. So when they don't, whether purposely or inadvertently, they're called to correction.
And this is how it has always been in the church. You go to the book of Acts, right? There's Peter, Paul, like there's this it's not a schism yet, but there's that potential that it's going in that direction. So they get together. There's a synod. They gather together. They are accountable to each other. You know, it seemed good to us, not me, us and the Holy Spirit. You know, and it's interesting if you look at a lot of the early canons that are coming from not just ecumenical councils, but the councils in general. A lot of it's not theological. A lot of it has to do with this kind of relational organization, right? The first ecumenical council, the bishops have to get together with the metropolitan, you know, this many times, this often, this regular, you know, so that there is that accountability, that there is that, you know, it's not just, you know, the bishop reading in a paper, oh, that bishop said this, calling them up on the phone and saying, no, it's, you know, as bishops, they have to get together. And as they're together, you know, usually the metropolitan, the archbishop, the patriarch, kind of that first among equals will say, you know, did you say this? Did this, you know, and then all together, they decide, you know, what's going to happen.
And then you can see how, like, going back to my example in the Episcopalian church, my thought was, I don't want to be in communion with this guy. Like, he's a bishop representing the church. I want to make it clear that I don't stand with him, you know. So, you know, that's the point. That's the mechanism of communion, is that it signifies that we already have these things in common. Now, what's happened in the modern era since the 60s is that as a result, ironically, of the free love movement of the 60s, everything has been turned around. Now the idea is that we have communion first, and then we reach some kind of unity. So it's kind of like how in the sexual revolution, the same, it's parallels, that instead of we have marriage and then we have union sexually, now in our society is we have sex, and then if it works out, maybe we get married, right? So obviously the church disagrees with that, right? We don't practice that. This is an innovation that's happened only since the 1960s. So that's why we practice closed communion. We guard very carefully who we have communion with, especially when it comes to a level of priests and bishops who are teaching in a public and official way. Because somebody might say, well, you know, I know this lay person over here who doesn't come to church very often, only comes at Christmas or something, and they believe that we turn into a butterfly when we die, or something. It's like, well, okay, that's something that, well, first of all, shouldn't be, it's above our pay grade, right, to deal with that. But that person isn't teaching those things publicly as a representative of the church, right? So it's a different matter. So usually these things happen at the level of the clergy. And if you are going to church with the clergy who are in good standing, then you're in good standing.
Does the policing really work in the Orthodox Church? I mean, are there real examples?
Yeah.
Now that you know of?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, what's happening with Ukraine is kind of a standoff where sides have drawn a line based on principles. Personally, I can see both sides of the argument. I think it's a difficult situation. I think that it will resolve itself in the spirit that Father Micah mentioned, that they're looking for ways now to get together and Orthodox council where they can officially discuss these things and come to a solution with the help of the Holy Spirit in their midst. I'm trying to think of some other examples.
I mean, I think maybe the most notable or that we would see most vividly is the theological, right? If I go to, you know, there's a lot of differences between, you know, if you go here or go to St. Simeon's on a Sunday morning, you know, the iconography, the architecture, the style, the music, there's differences. But when it comes to the dogma, when it comes to the theology, when it comes to our understanding of salvation, when it comes to the reality of the life in Christ, you know, we're 100% on the same page, as different as we may be. And I think the testament how well the system works, and maybe I need to preface that by saying, you know, this maybe is one of the greatest proofs of the Holy Spirit in the church. The fact that you can have, you know, 300 Greek men get together and at the end of it, come up with agreement. Right? You know, how many political parties are in Greece?
300.
12 million. So my point is you can go to an Orthodox church in England, in Russia, in Romania, and there's going to be those differences, but when it comes to the essentials, we're all on board. Now I've experienced priests that maybe in their preaching get a little like, oh, I don't know, I haven't heard that one. You know, where did you pull that from? And I think if that priest's voice, kind of gets maybe a little bit amplified. So I know just in our metropolis, without saying any names, I know a priest was saying something that made it to the ear of the bishop. The bishop, brought him in, and said, were you saying this? It was a theological thing. The priest said, yes, that's what I said. That's what I believe. The bishop said, that's not what we, the Orthodox Church, believes. So this priest was temporarily suspended. And again, that wasn't so much a punishment for being wrong about something, but it was pastoral and it was therapeutic to bring this priest back into that Orthodox understanding. Now sadly, what happened with this priest is he found another bishop that would let him get away with saying what he was saying. So he just, skipped to one of these quote unquote Orthodox churches that aren't in communion with the rest of the Orthodox Church. But all of that to say, I think the fact that we have that part, that what's essential of Christianity in common, and whenever it steps out, be it a bishop, right? Nestorius was Patriarch of Constantinople, right? He was anathematized, he was excommunicated.
So is the church, especially the Western parts of the Orthodox Church, do you think it's still going strong, resisting the virus of the virus that's going around a lot of parts of the world, especially the West right now? Is there
What virus?
the virus of modernism, postmodernism? I don't want to get political.
Right.
I could go on political side with what the virus is, but
Or let's say the prosperity gospel or some other theological heresy that we can't accept. Yeah, I mean, I think the Orthodox Church, you gotta look at it like it's a living organism, right? And so it's got these boundaries that it wants to protect, but it also changes, it adapts. One point I wanted to make about the schism is that, again, it was something that you have to, I guess, in order to answer a question, when was the schism, you have to pick one date, but really emphasizing that it was a process, and that it almost like what Dr. Blackos was asking about, kind of the levels of disagreement. It may start out as an awareness that this is a little different, or concerned, maybe you shouldn't do that. Then maybe they correct themselves, but if they don't, it takes it to another level. And then if more people get involved and they still don't correct themselves, it takes it to another level. So I think, really, if you look even through the 1100s, even though the schism is 1054, even if you look through the 1100s, there's still a lot in common between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. And in some areas where they hadn't received news of the schism, they didn't know anything. I mean, it's not like the modern world with Twitter and everything. So that, 100 years after the schism, they were still having communion. Now I think once you get to 1204, this is another date that kind of, again, it's a little bit arbitrary, but I think it's pretty fair. Somewhere around 1204 with the Crusades really kind of puts the end to, puts the nail in the coffin, and really sets back any attempt at reconciliation with rapprochement between the East and the West. So 1204, you have the Fourth Crusades, right?
Yeah, so without getting too into it, Sir Stephen Runciman has a phenomenal 4 volumes on the Crusades, and he's very much written. It's such an honest history.
He's a pleasure to read.
Yeah. And reading it, you know, he doesn't, like most of the histories before, just do a blanket, you know, glorification of the Crusaders as these noble Christian knights going into the East and getting rid of the Muslims and the Greek heretics. But he also doesn't do what some of these postmodern historians, you know, the Muslims were right. They were just these simple people that the evil Crusaders came in. It's very honest. It's very realistic. And if anything, it shows that the true victim of the Crusades was the Christians living in the East, right? You know, because the Muslims, you know, obviously didn't accept them. The Crusaders considered them heretics, and the Christians in the East, you know, basically got ground between the two. So in the earlier Crusades, you know, Armenians, Greeks, Orthodox Christians living in Jerusalem, living in Palestine, living in Syria, you know, they were as much victims as the Muslims from the Crusaders were coming in. In some ways, there was more hate, more violence directed towards them. So in 1204, there's a 4th crusade that's called. The Crusaders end up sacking Constantinople.
On their way to Jerusalem.
On their way to Jerusalem. And this, you know, again, I'll try not to get into the graduate level, but when you have that many people, I mean, you have thousands, tens of thousands of people traveling long distances. They have to be fed, right? They have to be, you know, there's all sorts of transportation, all these things, you know, so all this is promised, go, you know, and they're going from one place to another, you know, they're getting hungry, you know, you see what I'm saying? And so things just start devolving very quickly. They get to Constantinople. Now, this is a very, very interesting point, one that I don't think gets mentioned enough, because it makes very poignant what's to happen a little bit later. The Crusaders came into Constantinople and they started slaughtering the Turks and the Jews that lived there. Now, these were not the later Ottomans. These were different Turks, some of whom were allied with the people in Constantinople. And the emperor, his reigning guard, and the people of Constantinople stepped in to protect those non-Christians that were living in Constantinople. And that's when the Crusaders then turned on basically the Christians in the village. And it ended up being such a horrible and horrendous and violent sacking that the Crusaders did to Constantinople, that when the city finally fell to the Ottomans, there was a saying, better the turban of the Turk than the mitre of the Latin. That when Rome fell to the Ottomans, it was less violent, it was less cruelty than when they fell to the Crusaders. So obviously, this has left this horrible wound that has been felt in the East, really to this day, against the West, against the Roman Catholic Church. You know, people were so confused when again, someone I consider, you know, one of the greatest spiritual fathers of the 20th century, Patriarch Athenagoras, when he, as a loving gesture, together with the Pope, lifted the anathemas, not saying there's no difference, not saying we're in communion, but lifted the anathemas, you know, people were protesting, people were upset. When the Pope went to visit Greece for the first time, there's rioting in the street. You know, people in the West are like, come on, Like,
They were holding signs that said, remember 1204.
yeah,
Oh, wow.
I mean, people don't understand,
This
yeah.
was 2000 or.
So I don't know if you've heard this, and maybe Dr. Vlahos may know something about this. But no, I know. So those books that I referenced, Runciman's books on the Crusades, when they were translated into modern Greek for the first time, it was at the time when the junta was in charge of Greece, and they would not let those books be published publicly. They circulated them among the generals, among the military, to help give them an idea of kind of the political idea that was going on. But there was a fear that if people, saw what really happened back then, that it would further stoke this anger towards the West, which might, of all things, push them towards the East, which at that time was Soviet Russia. So they actually felt the need to, in a sense, keep these books hidden because of that historical wound. That was not the final fall of Constantinople, but Constantinople, the East Roman Byzantine Empire, never, truly recovered from that. You can see it in the populations of the city. You go from what was the most populous city on the planet to really what ended up being a number of almost small villages within the walls of Constantinople. So from the fall to the Crusaders, and then the final fall of the Ottomans, you have a lot of discussion going back. Largely what we have here is the emperor seeing the money, seeing the militaries of the West, was trying to get support, to fight the Turks. Because really at this time, the Byzantine Empire is Constantinople, Thessaloniki, southern Greece, not even most of what is now modern day Greece, was still held by, the Venetians or some of these Crusader states. The Pontus region of the Black Sea, and that's pretty much it. Just across the Bosporus is Ottoman land, and so the emperors would go to, we had one emperor who was Manuel III, went all the way to London, went to Paris, went to Rome, to try to get support to fight the Ottomans. And almost inevitably, the condition that was placed on that support was, well, you have to be on the same page as us in regards to the Pope, in regards to the theology, in regards to all these issues. And so you have these instances, we have these councils. So for example, probably the most famous is the Council of Florence and Ferrara, where you have bishops from the East going over to Florence and Ferrara, and you have the emperor putting a very firm hand on these bishops, saying, this is an existential crisis, we're going to fall to the Turks, just sign the piece of paper. A lot of the bishops did. I think most of these bishops were doing it just because the emperor said, just out of support. I don't think they would have changed anything when they got back. Most of them knew better than to say anything about it when they get back to their see, because the people aren't on board with it. But you have St. Mark of Ephesus, St. Mark of Ionikos, who not only did he say, we can't sign this, we can't agree to this union, but this is the theological reasons why. And to sign a union, you're essentially supporting it. So we can't do that. So St. Mark was one of the few voices that spoke out against it. And he really addresses everything. I don't know how much of this stuff has been translated, probably not enough of it, but he talks about purgatory. He talks about, he was in some ways a spiritual grandson or great grandson of St. Gregory Palamas. He talks about the essence and energies distinction that were part of that ninth ecumenical council we talked about. He really covers everything. He even talks about the theological implications of the differences in statues and iconography. But ultimately, the bishops either agreed with him or were cowed into agreeing with him. And that union, if you ask the Roman Catholics, they say the union took place, the bishops agreed. But there was nothing that came from it, let's say. There were several other attempts at a union, none of it came through. A number of these later Byzantine emperors actually did convert to Catholicism in the hope that that would bring them support. Sadly, when Constantinople fell, May 29th, 1453, the majority of the military actually was Westerners, but people that were probably in it out of either respect, so the Venetian that were there just felt like, Rome can't fall. We lost it in the West, we can't lose it in the East.
The new Rome, Constantinople was new Rome.
And so we have the Turcocratia.
So Turcocratia is the Greek word for meaning the reign of the Turks. So this period of Turkish occupation, Ottoman occupation. So from 1453, again, that date is a little bit arbitrary because it started really earlier, like Thessaloniki fell in, I think, 1417 or so. And finally,
Asia Minor almost 200 years before that.
Yeah, so finally, once you get to 1450s, it's only Constantinople basically that's left. And finally, that falls. So throughout the 1400s, let's say, or 1400s, you have Byzantium shrinking. Finally, it falls, and this leads to this period of Turkish occupation from 1453 until really 1917, until the end of World War I, when the Turkish Empire, Ottoman Empire is broken up. You have this period of Turkish occupation, which means that Greece really wasn't independent for almost 500 years, and that they lived under Muslim overlords who taxed them as second-class citizens, the dhimmi. So when we hear Turcocratia or Ottoman occupation, you're dealing with a specific period, 400 or 500 years in Greek history, approximately at the same time that the Protestant Reformation is going on in the West. This is what's going on in the East. So they didn't have the luxury of knowing anything about what was going on with the Protestant Reformation in the West. They were simply trying to survive from day to day. So the Enlightenment that takes place in the West and the Protestant Reformation really have very little impact on the church in Greece in particular.
Can I just get a spelling of that author that wrote the Crusade books that you said you liked?
So R-U-N-C-I-M-A-N.
Okay, Stephen Runciman.
Yeah.
Okay.
He wrote a book called The Fall of Constantinople,
Right.
which is also remarkable.
The Great Church in Captivity is another really good book.
If you're ever afraid to cry in front of another person, don't read that book in a public place.
Okay.
His writing, the content, the history that he draws on it.
He was considered I think he's passed now.
Yeah.
The preeminent Byzantine historian of the 20th century. Interestingly, I don't know if he ever converted.
No.
He was Episcopalian Anglican, but he famously said that Orthodoxy will be the religion of the 21st century.
Oh, really?
He predicted.
I
Yeah.
just want to make sure I had it right, because the way y'all were really in favor of him, I wanted to read some of this.
Yeah.
So two things. One, before even getting to the what was going on when the Christians were living there with the Ottomans, that period of time when the East Rome, that Byzantine Empire was just coming to nothing, actually is sometimes referred to as the Paleologan Renaissance, or the last Byzantine Renaissance. If you look at the iconography, If you look at the philosophy, in some ways, this was kind of the pinnacle. This is something I think we sometimes forget, is that the greatness of an empire isn't in its size, and isn't in its wealth. In some ways, the treasures that came from this last flowering of culture, of theology, really in some ways are unparalleled. In addition to that, most of the people, at least that were well off, that had received kind of a formal education at this time, they learned how to read, with Homer. They had Homer in one hand and the Book of Psalms in the other hand. So their level of Greek, their level of education, a lot of them had a lot of wealth. And when Constantinople fell, some went to Italy, some went to the west, some went north to what is now Romania, some all the way to what is now or what became Russia. But very important thing to remember. Have many of you guys studied philosophy in high school?
I did college.
In college, so you read Aristotle, you read Plato, in the original Greek or English? Okay. All of those manuscripts, everything we have of Aristotle, everything we have of Plato, was preserved by the Byzantines.
Wow.
We don't have, we have a few fragments that are from Plato or Aristotle from before the Christianization of the empire. But the texts that we have of these philosophers was preserved in the Christian East. But it was always read within this Christian phronema, this Christian understanding, with this understanding that philosophy is the handmaid of the theology. But what happened is when these aristocracy left to Italy, they brought this Greek learning. They brought Aristotle. They brought, but they did not necessarily bring that Orthodox phronema. So in some ways, things like the Renaissance, things like scholasticism, the seed that led to it was this Byzantine Renaissance. But instead of exercising and baptizing Aristotle the way that St. Gregory of Palamas did, they basically dressed Christ in some Aristotelian garb.
And I should point out here that so while what he's saying is going on in the East, right? So, and he's talking particularly about maybe 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, this last Renaissance. And it's not only that, it's all of Byzantium, So what I'm trying to say is, even the term Byzantium, we're talking about the Eastern Orthodox Church. We don't really get this idea of East versus West until 476. 476, what happens? Anybody know?
Council of Florence.
476, you have the fall of Rome. The fall of Rome from the barbarians in the north, right? So the fall of Rome in 476 leaves like this huge mark on the West, right? So that's what the West then enters into what's known as the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, right? And so you have this going backwards in terms of education, and they're not reading Aristotle and Plato. They're barely literate. And then meanwhile, the eastern part of the empire is continuing on just as before with high levels of education and continuing throughout the centuries into the 12, 13, 1400s. Meanwhile, the western part has gone into this deep ignorance and darkness, which they just start to emerge from when you get to, let's say, the 1200s, 1100s, or 1200s. They're starting to emerge from this, and they're borrowing the things that have been preserved in Byzantium. And many people argue that it was actually via the Muslims Muslims actually pushing from the east benefited from the preservation of all these texts that the Orthodox had made. And then when the Muslims pushed across northern Africa into Spain, they brought this learning with them to the West, basically, and helped was the seed or the impetus for the Renaissance in the West. So it's kind of a tale of two cities going on during the Middle Ages, because you have the West during this really period of darkness until maybe 1100 at least, whereas the East is really flourishing. Then once you hit 1453, you have the East, it's particularly Greece, really go downhill. The West starts blooming for better or worse with the Enlightenment, and then you also have Russia. So Russia becomes an extension of the East, and really all the Orthodox power from 1453 shifts to Russia. So there you have an imperial government. The imperial government is firmly Orthodox, and really the power of the Orthodox world shifts from 1453 until the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, is in Russia. Then you have, after World War I, you have a lot of chaos. 1917, everything is broken up. You have Russia turning into the Soviet Union, communism. And so the 20th century is kind of its own story. But just to give you an idea of what's happening in the East versus the West. So during this period of darkness, let's say in the Middle Ages in the West, you have the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church continuing to grow. And it's probably most of the Protestant, and this is my opinion, many of the Protestant complaints are very legitimate. You have a lot of abuse of authority. The hierarchy of the Western Church tend to become very secular. See what else?
I mean, at the division between the laity and the cleric in the West is something. It's much less. Than it is today, or it was much more than it is today, even in the West. But that never really happened in the East, that sharp divide. I think part of that was because, historically in the East, the majority of clergy have always been married, right? I can only, feel so self-righteous and high and mighty, when my wife is reminding me that she cleans my underwear. I'm not disconnected. There's no way for me to disconnect, quote unquote, from the laity, because I have a wife and a child that are lay people, right? I live within it. And so, during this dark ages, the church becomes this divide between laity and clergy becomes so strong that by the time of the Reformation, a lay person was not allowed to receive the blood of Christ, right? They could only receive the body, right? Only the priests could have both, right? So this was again something that I think was avoided in the East.
But that still goes on today, doesn't it, in the Catholic Church?
Yeah, it can. So I think it doesn't have to. I think since Vatican II, it's kind of left up to the person.
On EWT and on a lot of.
I think some of the quote unquote traditional Catholics will still do it that way.
When did they make it where that priests had to be celibate? Do you know roughly when that happened?
During those dark ages, right?
Like,
so by
century maybe.
I think the 7th, 8th century. If not a little bit, not a little bit earlier. I think it varied from place to place.
But some argue that part of what was behind it at least was a concern because you have in the West 476, Rome collapses, so you don't really have any strong political power in the West, right? So the Pope, who already is kind of isolated from the other bishop being so far in the West, starts to assume more and more temporal secular power, right? In the vacuum of the political power.
The invasions, to deal with the invasions whenever you collapse, the Visigoths coming down, they had to become like a military organization to deal with, to maintain any power, right?
Yes, exactly. So forget where I was going with that.
Sorry.
No, I forget where my point was, but that was a big difference, so you have in the West this consolidation of power in the church, whereas in the East, you still have the symphonia, we call it, where you have the double-headed eagle that you see all the time. It's supposed to be the political power and the church power, and they're both equal and they serve each other. Whereas in the West, the model became that the church power just totally usurped the political power because there was none left. So you got to kind of keep that in mind when examining these things. And then, so that's what was my point. So some people say that the celibacy was actually a way because the church owned all the church property, all this property. And so if, Father Gregory is in Birmingham, all the property, and I'm celibate, all the property would be registered in my name, right? So what does that mean? That means that if I have a family, technically I could leave all of it to my child. Instead of what I'm supposed to do is leave it to the next priest or whatever. So part of the idea of the celibacy was to protect the church property. Because if you're celibate, and it's interesting, the Catholics to this day make a distinction between celibacy and chastity. They're two different things for the Catholics. Celibacy means you're not married. Chastity means, you're continent in your sexual relations. So even to this day, especially like in South America, it's a big deal in the Catholic Church in South America, is that the priests frequently are not chaste. They're celibate, but they're not chaste. So it's common that they would have a mistress, for example, and perhaps children, but the key is they're not married, so they're not legitimate heirs, right?
And it didn't end up working. You know anything about the history of the papal state? Even in the cases where you did have quote unquote continent pope, he had sisters, had kids. Now there's been times that again, I'm not saying anything that's not part of the history of the Catholic Church, where all of the cardinals were at most second cousins of the current pope, right? It still ended up having that familial presence. But the last point I want to make is and this maybe touches a little bit too on again, it's not an area I'm real familiar with, but the Reformation, Counter-Reformation. When the Orthodox Christians fell, right? When Constantinople fell, it varied from time to time. Different sultans treated the Christians in different ways. Some were very favorable. But there were two things that the Christians suffered, regardless of how progressive the sultan may have been, or how highly he looked on the Christians in his empire. One is you had a system of the Janissaries, right? That meant that the Turks would go into the village. They would round up all the young boys. They'd look at their teeth, they'd look at their eyes, they'd ask them questions. And I'm talking about like under 5 years old. And if the boy was particularly handsome, if he was well-spoken, he looked like he was going to be strong, they would take him. They would indoctrinate him, they would make him Muslim, they would give him the finest food, they would give him wealth. They basically created what ended up being like the Sultan's personal stormtroopers. And then more horrendous, or if maybe not more horrendous, but as horrendous as that, if that village didn't pay its taxes, if that village rebelled, guess who was going to lead the charge? Guess who you were going to see coming to burn your village? Your son. Right? The monstrosity of that is incalculable. In some places this ended up, some people actually desired it because it was a way to get wealth. It was a way to be in favor. Many Christians tried to hide their sons, and whole villages sometimes were killed for trying to hide their sons. In the case of young girls,
they would they hit them in the knees and break their legs.
Yeah,
So they're not taking.
yeah.
The story.
You know, I know in the case of women, you know, that it was very, very common at certain times during this Turkocratia. If you had a girl, and you can tell as a little child, like, she's gonna be a beauty, she's gonna be a real beauty. You know what they would do to that infant? They would tattoo a cross to the forehead. I actually found some old photographs. This English guy went to Asia Minor during the late 1800s, when photography had just come around, and he was taking pictures of villagers and stuff. And it showed all these Cappadocian women that had these tattoos, because the Turks wouldn't want to marry someone that had a cross tattooed on the forehead. So they suffered from that. And the other thing that they suffered from was basically if you went to court, no matter how right you were, no matter how much evidence, if your word was always secondary to the word of someone who was Muslim, right, there's nothing you could do. And on top of that, if that Muslim could somehow convince the judge that you had recanted your Christianity at some point in time, then it was ultimate. It was death penalty, right? And so those two things the people suffered under. Not having, and then at times it was, you know, they always, during the 400 years, they always had those two things going on. The Janissaries changed a little bit later than Meyer, but those essentially were the two things. There were times though when it was illegal, you could be punished for teaching Greek to the children. You could be, you know, taxed for going to church, right? You know, if you're a village with a priest, you have to pay this much money. If you're a village without a priest, you only have to pay this much. So there are all these insidious things going on. But with all these things going on, the piety of the people, the faithfulness of the people, when Greece had its independence, you could go there and be like, wait, what's different here? Like, why is it that they're still Christian? And I think it was because of the liturgy, right? It was because of the liturgy that no matter how painful, no matter how difficult life was, when people gathered together on a Sunday morning in these beautiful churches filled with iconography, they were given a taste of the kingdom, right? And so when they lost their money, and they even lost their children, not just had their children martyred, that would have been a glorious thing, but had their children turned into ultimately the great enemy, they could have hope, because they had tasted, they had glimpsed the kingdom. And so the liturgy, the hymns, right, the theological literacy of some of these people during the Turkocratia shames me as a priest who has 8+ years of secondary education, because all they had were the services, were the liturgy books, were the book of Psalms, was Holy Week, all these things. And so that's what preserved Christianity during those 400 years. That's I think that's where our authority is, right? Anything, whether it's what a bishop says or what a priest preaches, if it doesn't conform to what we experience in the worship of the Orthodox Church, if it's not confirmed, and St. Irenaeus says our faith is conformed to the Eucharist, and the Eucharist confirms our faith, is not accepted, right? And so in the West, when the Pope has this is sola scriptura, all these things. You know, in the East, they had this Christian liturgical life that preserved them, of which we are the inheritors of.
I'll just say here to cover the last thing on the syllabus, that in the West, when you have the rise of Protestantism, there's a lot of good reasons that Protestantism flourishes against the abuses of the Catholic Church. Part of what gives Protestantism a springboard throughout Europe is not just theology, but political considerations. Again, because the Pope had both a temporal and a spiritual power. The Papal States included most of Europe. So what happened was, especially these German princes who had these small fiefdoms in Germany, they embraced Protestantism because it meant that they didn't have to pay tribute to the Pope. So it was politically expedient for them to become Protestant. Whether they actually gave a crap or not, who knows, you know.
Or if you wanted to get married a third time.
Oh, yeah, if you want to get married at that time. So then this leads to the 100 Years' War in Europe, which actually was over 100 years. War between Protestantism and Catholicism, and which states were going to side with which. Were you going to be a member of the Papal States or aligned with the Pope, whether you were going to be Protestant and try to hold on to your fiefdom. So you have political instability, misery in Europe, millions of deaths. And finally, what happens is at the Treaty of Westphalia, you have this agreement that we're going to remove religion from the public sphere. And this is the birth of secularism in the West. This is a direct result of the conflicts, the political conflicts between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism in Western Europe after the Protestant Reformation. All right, so I think that's a good place to end. Yeah, Logan.
It wasn't 100 Years' War, it was 30 Years' War, that was Catholicism versus Protestantism. The 100 Years' War is between England and France,
Okay,
so I'll let you know.
all right, thank you. All right, thank you guys.
I got one question.
Yeah.
About something you said earlier, Paul, Micah. Talk about Aristotle and Plato,
Yeah.
and those things were intended to be for the handmaid of
And
Orthodox
it's,
theology.
so from the Cappadocians, people like Saint Gregory, Saint Basil, they use, or Saint Maximus with Plotinus, or Saint Dionysius with Porphyry. Like they found the good, right? Like a bee, the nectar from the flower. You can't make honey out of the whole flower, it's gonna be poisonous.
And like where the problem came in then was people that took, like Aristotle and Plato's things, but you didn't have the pronoia.
That mindset, yeah,
Then
exactly.
you saw it wrong and it became a monster. pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you have scholasticism, like, you have, if you look at, some of the things that Thomas Aquinas wrote. I mean, actually, if you look at the whole of Thomas Aquinas's writings, the teacher, there's a reference to Aristotle, not Jesus, who's actually referenced more,
Correct.
but anyway, yeah.
So the wrong pronoia made it a monster instead of a handmaid.
Yeah, I think, if you aren't living the life of the Orthodox Church, you don't know what to differentiate, right? And it's not that there weren't misreadings of more often Platonism in the East, but it was noticed, it was sorted out. If you have Orthodox, someone living in Constantinople who starts saying, well, it's pretty clear in Plato that souls pre-existed. Well, no, that's absolutely no, right? That would be trying to somehow conform Christianity to this Platonic way of thinking.
Right.
Gotcha. Is it normal, like in the catechism classes, to go to talk about the Neoplatonist and Platonist threads within the Orthodox faith? Is that something that
A little bit grad school.
It's one of my favorite topics. Though.
Yes.
I'd love to get some copy of these.
Yeah. One-on-one.
Yeah.
The classes are just kind of to cover the undergrad material with a little. I like to tell the undergrad material is there. How many sacraments are there? 7. If you're an undergrad and you write 7 sacraments on your test, I'll give you 100. If you're a grad student and you write there 7 sacraments, I'll give you a 0.
Right.
Because there are many, many sacraments.
right?
All right, thanks, Dave. To the praise of our Holy Fathers, who praise their God, have mercy on us. Amen.
Amen.